morning to everyone in Manila and good evening to Lisbeth. Welcome everyone. This is a kickoff meeting towards the education sector group retreat. It's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Lisbeth Steer to ADB today to share the work of the Education Commission. She's the director of the Education Commission, which is chaired by former UK Prime Minister and UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown. Lisbeth will be speaking to us today on the highlights and key recommendations of the white paper, Education Priorities in Response to COVID-19 Disruptions, which was issued as part of the Save Our Future campaign. The white paper is the result of consultations with the hundreds of experts and the participation of all major international organizations working on education globally. ADB was also actively involved in that. The white paper is based on the premise that COVID-19 is coming on top of an already severe learning crisis, and unless strong and urgent actions are taken, the crisis will turn into a catastrophe. It outlined several calls to action to governments to turn this crisis into new departures to make education investments, bring the economic and social returns they are supposed to deliver. The white paper comes off the back of several influential reports that Lisbeth and the Education Commission have put out, the Learning Generation Report, the Education Workforce Report. Lisbeth has also spearheaded the International Finance Facility for Education, which will be an innovative financing instrument expected to be a major MDB coalition to support education. Lisbeth has deep and extensive experience in international development research and policy. Prior to joining the Education Commission, she was a fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution and was director of the Overseas Development Institute's flagship program on development progress. She's lived and worked in our part of the world, in Vietnam, Indonesia, Laos, and Cambodia. She's directed programs on the ground for the Asia Foundation and the World Bank and IFC. Lisbeth has written extensively on development finance and education and has presented in a wide range of fora. She's currently on the global board for Generation Unlimited and the Education Outcomes Fund. Those of us who've met her even briefly would know that she's a great champion for education, and she's a tireless optimist with an emphasis on putting compelling evidence on the table to argue for change and reform in education. So we are delighted that you're joining us today, Lisbeth. We will start with a presentation by you for about 25 minutes or so, and this will be followed by Q&A and discussions. Over to you, Lisbeth.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shanti, and thank you to Brajesh and the whole team. I am really so delighted to be speaking to you all today because I am not only have I worked in Asia, but actually I did a lot of other things there. I met my husband there. I had my first 2 children there. Basically, the most important parts of my life were in your part of the world. So for me, it's always a real pleasure to be reconnecting with Asia. And I really look forward to also hearing from you all how things are going and what your challenges are at the moment. So as Shanti said, I will go through the main findings of the white paper. And again, I should highlight the amazing role that ADB also played in that. And we are really looking forward to continuing our collaboration with you on Save Our Future and some of the other work we are doing. So I'll try and share my screen without making a mess of it. And you can tell me if you are seeing the screen. Are you seeing the slide? Great. So this is the title of the report, and it's also available on the web. And I also recommend there are a number of background reports that fed into this white paper, which are really interesting to look at, and it has a lot more detail on some of the action areas presented in the report. So if I go to the next slide, and you're seeing the full slide, right? Could I just confirm that, Shanti? Yeah, good, great. So just briefly, I will talk about the crisis. I'm sure you are familiar with much of that, the potential, the actions, and the next steps, and also related to what potentially ADB could be doing. So the report lays out three headline statistics with respect to the crisis, and I would say you are probably already familiar with them. But even as professionals who spend a lot of time in education, we're always struck by this picture that you see on the screen, which is the number of children that are not reading at age 10 globally. And before the pandemic, that was already 53%. And because of the pandemic, that will likely increase with another 10%. And those are just the initial figures. In some of the lowest income countries, this number of children not learning or not being able to read a simple text at age 10 can be up to 90%, which is again a really problematic statistic we are all very worried about. In the report, there's actually some data that breaks this down by region, and you can see obviously a large number of children not learning are in Asia and the Pacific. You have very, very populous countries. That is one of the reasons. But there are obviously in some of the more populous countries like Indonesia, India, Pakistan, the numbers of not learning are quite large, 35% in Indonesia, 55% in India, up to 75% in Pakistan. So you are in a region that really, really needs support from obviously wonderful institutions like the bank. So again, we talked about some of the South Asian countries, but even in Southeast Asia, where we generally have had some wonderful countries making progress, we also still have some low numbers, and these are numbers that have just been released in terms of sort of percentage that are reading at the end of primary. Again, some are pretty low. But then the second piece, the second big headline here is about investment. So what the crisis has done is slowing the growth of the developing countries and the developed world. So we have a cutback of or a decline in revenues, which then in many cases has led to cutbacks in education budget. A recent survey done by the UN show that about 40% of low and low middle income countries were already reporting cuts in education budgets because of the sort of decline of revenue, but also in large part at the moment because of the shift to packages in health and economic recovery. At the same time, we also have falling household budgets, which is a real problem. And declines in remittance flows. And I know also Asia has depends a lot on these flows. And it is also a source of financing for education. So the combination of the declines in revenues in governments with the declines of household budgets, and then also the declines in aid flows are really setting us up for a serious crisis in terms of financing education. And that will particularly affect likely the furthest behind and potentially exacerbate the inequities. The third crisis obviously is one of inequality, and we know these figures. I don't need to repeat them to you, but there are, particularly because of the pandemic, you've likely heard about the concerns around girls dropping out. There's obviously the widening of inequities because of the digital divide. The data show that a third of children in Asia Pacific cannot be reached at all by digital or broadcast remote learning programs, either due to a lack of effective policies or just lack of connectivity. But even if we can provide access, that doesn't necessarily mean that therefore children will be using that. And there's the famous study that was just recently done also in Bangladesh, where they showed that in secondary schools there were a large number of children who had access, up to half of them access to remote learning, but at the end of the day, there were only few of them who actually chose to take advantage of that or could take advantage of that. So the remote learning issue is really complex. It's not just a matter of facilities, but also of the connections, but also of whether there are facilitators around who can help children engage with these platforms. Obviously, I don't need to repeat the potential of education. One of the key messages of the white paper is that we really need to put education at the heart of the recovery of COVID-19 and the heart of the longer term prospects for the SDGs writ large, whether it's climate change or employability and so on. And I have to say, this is an area where we are currently still failing. Many discussions are currently ongoing about the COVID recovery, and the education sector doesn't tend to be at the table very much. And so that's one of the things that I definitely would like to hear your reaction to, even at the country level, when finance ministers are making decisions on financing packages or recovery packages, stimulus packages. How much are we able to really influence that to the benefit of education? So as Shanti said, the Save Our Future effort was a huge effort of a lot of organizations who came together to try and come up with a common narrative. And there were particularly a group of 14 of those organizations who issued the white paper together and signed on to its recommendations, and ADB was one of them. And there were the others who you can see listed here on this page. So let me just go into the actions that were recommended. The first action, obviously, is one you have thought about a lot, and that is, how could we make sure that we can reopen schools as quickly and as safely as possible and deliver vital services? So safe reopening means obviously making sure there's basic sanitation and an opportunity to implement social distancing and ensure the health and safety of students as well as the education workforce. The white paper has a key recommendation around the treatment of teachers as essential workers and giving them priority access to the vaccines whenever they become available. The second piece is the vital services, which we include psychological and socio-emotional support. As children will be coming back to school, they will need this more than ever. They need it right now as well. But also the provision of school meals, which has also been identified as a real issue in this particular period. Further incentives in the form of cash transfers that can bring children back to school will be necessary, especially for these groups like girls who may not return if they don't get additional incentives. One of the key things, which is what is actually on this picture here, is that the paper really advocates for the full range of benefits and the services that are being given to children, not just teaching and learning within the classroom, but also all these things that a child receives when it does come to school, and that includes the nutrition and the school meals in a big way. And we have found that a lot of children, and this is now also confirmed by the WFP, millions of children have been left without school feeding and without meals. And actually, one of the countries where the biggest number of children are receiving those meals is India, is in your region. And we know that India has been trying to be very creative in terms of bringing these meals to children in all sorts of ways through sort of home delivery. This issue has really become important to us and has been put on the front of the agenda because the World Food Programme was also part of the consortium and has been really critical in raising the awareness around this issue. The second action is a need to really try and focus on building foundational skills. That is the reason why the paper pays so much attention to this, is because we really were trying to look at how could we focus on the marginalized. What do we need to do to really reach the poorest of the children? And that is primarily through, especially if you look in the education system, through focusing on foundational skills, because that's where children obviously often get stuck. And those who are currently in secondary education are often there because they have had other advantages. So really focusing on these poorest and on the foundational skills is really essential to building the foundation for the other skills that obviously are important, the 21st century and the employability skills. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, one doesn't need to focus on these skills, but we are really trying to kind of create a greater priority and focus on these particular skills, get people's attention to that. The paper also discusses 3 principles for ensuring an improvement in those foundational skills, and that is through these principles of inclusivity, adaptive learning, and interactive learning. And I'd point out particularly the adaptive point here, which is really critical in this time, because many children will return to school with learning losses, and it will be critical to adapt the teaching to the level of the children and the level of their learning and where they are at. This is not only critical in terms of the response to COVID, but it's also been proven to be the most effective way to get learning improvements. So over time, focusing on adaptive, interactive ways of teaching is really important to also make education and learning inclusive and reach the furthest behind. A recent paper has been produced by the Asian Development Bank by Kirsty Newman, who's been working with us as well on the quality of teaching in the Asia Pacific region, and also looking at what the teaching practices are. And what this paper finds is that the practices are basically still the more standardized reading from textbooks, recitation, and so on. And there is not that much evidence of the kinds of adaptive and interactive teaching that's required to improve learning. Now, that doesn't mean that the training programs haven't tried to do so and haven't tried to bring that differentiated instruction, but often this doesn't translate in practice, which is one of the issues we need to address. I should also say that actually the technology offers huge opportunities here. Adaptive teaching, differentiated instruction could be greatly enhanced by the use of technological platforms, and especially adaptive platforms. And we've been working with ADB in Vietnam, and are also looking at some other countries on this idea of introducing high-touch, high-tech adaptive technologies in teaching and learning, and looking at how effective that could be. And I'd be happy to talk about that a little more. Action 3 is around focusing on the workforce. And when we say workforce, we don't only talk about teachers, even though teachers are obviously the drivers of learning, and we know they are very important. But one of the key messages the report makes is that teachers cannot act alone. And we need to get much better at thinking about the entire workforce, or the entire team of people that surrounds children, to make them learn effectively. And that includes not only teachers, it includes teacher trainees, it may include communities, it could include health support, school principals, and so on and so on. And what the pandemic has really taught us is that when we're in a crisis and when we really need to focus, that actually happens. So many people have been engaged in so many ways in the education system. And the key is now to maintain that beyond the pandemic, but because these types of learning team approaches have proven to be very effective in improving learning around the world. So that's one big message. The second big message is around school leadership. In many countries, school leadership has been too focused on administration, on making sure that forms are filled in and that particular kind of things are done that maybe government requires, and much too little focused on supporting the teaching staff. And so key here is to think about this concept of instructional leadership, which is really turning the leadership of schools towards the teaching staff and the human resources, rather than kind of a compliance to what is required in the education system. And then obviously, in general, a really important issue is professional development. And we can come back to that later as well, because there's a lot that can be said about how we could do better in terms of supporting professional development. We haven't succeeded very well in the past necessarily in doing this, but more and more research is showing how to do this effectively, and we need to pay attention to that. On technology, so action number 4 is focused on the role of technology. And here, the key and the first sort of thought that is presented in the paper is about doing no harm. It is not about let's just throw all the resources we have at creating great new connectivity and super highways. It is really focused on thinking about the resources we have available, and then thinking about, if we do invest in technology, can we make sure it benefits those furthest behind? And can we make sure that interventions are cost effective, so that we are not investing huge amounts of resources into something that maybe then diverts resources away from other, perhaps more cost effective approaches. So technology is critical, but we need to roll it out in a really thoughtful way. And so when we think about technology, we can think about it in 3 ways. We can think about it in terms of how it faces the student, or how students can use it, how it faces the teacher and how teachers could use it, and how it could support the system. And what we are recommending in the white paper is that in this immediate response, perhaps the most effective way or use of technology, while the infrastructure is still somewhat challenging for most children, is to focus on the teachers and on the systems. So can we use technology to enhance teacher training? Can we use technology to enhance the availability of data, especially on those children who are left behind, and so on? And there are some good practices out there, again, that are showing now how this can be done. In the Philippines, for example, there's evidence of teacher-focused edtech that is apparently making good progress. You will know more about this than I do. The 5th area is about investment. And here the key message is protect education budgets. And when you do then apply and allocate budgets, prioritize the poor, and within that also look at sort of this foundational, this progression. So that doesn't mean we don't invest in secondary or higher education. It just means that if we do invest in secondary and higher education, let's make sure we prioritize the poorest and the most and the furthest behind. And that's actually a really tricky thing to do, because politically speaking, allocation of budgets is very, very sensitive. And we see that especially the MDBs could play a really important role, because you have the relationships with ministers of finance, with ministers of education, to have that conversation. The 6th action is around mobilization of international resources. And here we have a number of big messages around the need to increase aid and to make sure that we can get some debt relief. And again, the debt relief ideally linked to development purposes, whether that is education. Some debt relief can be linked also to climate issues, but we need to make sure that debt relief has, that if there is relief, that the reinvestment can go towards good purposes. And then the second piece is, to the extent possible, allocating resources, especially when we talk about bilateral donors, through multilateral channels. That means obviously the MDBs. It also means some of the global funds, so the Global Partnership for Education, Education Cannot Wait. Each of these funds play a very important role, and they have a role in actually focusing resources on the poorest, on the furthest behind, which isn't always the case when we look at some of the bilateral spending, and that needs to be addressed. Finally, there's a real need to look at innovative financing, because at the moment, the projections around the funding gap are huge. They are way beyond what we have in terms of ODA at the moment. That's about 16 billion a year. UNESCO, in its last estimates, has now predicted that we may have a financing gap of 200 billion. Clearly, if we just go with ODA, we will not get there. That's why the Commission has been working very hard on trying to establish the International Finance Facility, and the ADB has been a wonderful partner in this. The International Finance Facility will provide additional capital to the MDBs that's specifically purposed or focused on education. So it releases potentially an additional stream of funding that could be deployed for education across the MDBs. There are 4 MDBs engaged at the moment. So we really hope that that will be established soon, later this year or early next, and that will be available in particular for lower middle income countries where the largest number of children are, and many of these countries are in the Asia Pacific region. So finally, the action number 7 is about better use of resources. Again, this is not something new to you. The need to really bring evidence in the way we deploy resources. Too much money is still spent on things that don't work, or at least we don't have enough evidence on whether they work. And also there is a real need to become more effective at collaborating across the international system, and UNESCO is leading a process to do so. I wanted to finish with 2 more minutes on kind of how ADB can really be a partner in moving things forward. And these are just some ideas from the white paper where we think that you can play a particularly important role. The first one is around prioritization, because at the country level, it is really hard. I know that ADB has been conducting a study around sort of where countries want to invest their money versus where we know the biggest problems are. That doesn't always join up. Many countries are very concerned about their employment, about the labor markets. They have huge pressures from perhaps the corporations to invest in higher education and skilling and upskilling. And that is a really important area to invest in. But the question is, do we invest the public resources in there, or do we try to think about fully financing education, bringing in new forms of financing, innovative financing, private financing to cover that, rather than really putting the majority of public resources into those parts of the education system, which happens in many countries. So that conversation around having plans that are fully financing education, partly the public sector, partly the private sector, is something I think MDBs and ADB in particular are really well placed to lead on. On EdTech, you are in the region of the world everybody is watching in terms of the next generation of technology, deploying technology in ways that we can't even think of, sitting in the United States or in Europe. It will be really important to think about how we use technology, again, pointing out the issue of the inequalities, using technology for teacher training, using technology for data and monitoring of how the system is doing, how well things are working is really important. And you could play a big role, obviously student facing as well. International funding, I don't need to say how much we love your engagement in the International Finance Facility, really encouraging you to look at where the demand is, and encouraging the demand in the countries for this will be important. And then this is sort of the last piece it connects to the first one. Prioritization of public resources also needs to coincide with finding new finance for parts of the system that may not be funded by the public sector, which is obviously some of the upskilling. There are many ways that we could think about new ways to fund that. And that is also an area where we think you could really play a big role. So I'll leave it to that and really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth, for walking us through a very insightful set of findings as well as specific recommendations and calls for action. We already have a few questions in the chat box. Maybe we can start with that, and then people can please raise your hand if you want to ask a question or share a point. Um, Lisbeth,
I'll,
the
I'll stop sharing my screen.
first question, couple of questions are about what's the definition of foundational skills. From Paul Vanderberg and Sutaram, they want to know what are the types of foundational skills that are most important. You've stressed this as a point for action for ADB. And Paul
Yeah.
wants to know if the focus on digital skills and entrepreneurship skills will actually crowd out the attention to foundational skills.
Yeah. So this is actually a really critical area of debate as well, because obviously the way it's defined in the learning poverty metric, or the way it's defined in the SDG, is around literacy and numeracy. But in the discussions we had around the white paper, there were a number of partners who were highlighting that it doesn't mean because we're focusing on literacy and numeracy and those skills which tend to or should be put in place in the early years, that we can't at the same time also build some of these soft skills. And building these soft skills, which are then related to creativity, the types of things that we are talking about when we talk about 21st century skills, building those soft skills can actually be done once we start looking at these new pedagogies. So if we are starting to look at more adaptive, interactive types of teaching, you also can build at the same time these soft skills. So I do agree that I would tend to say, let's not narrow ourselves completely to saying this is only about a child's ability to read or a child's ability to do basic numbers. What we also really want to look at is, in that process of teaching numeracy and literacy, could we also encourage these soft skills? And I think there are now ways that this can be done. And actually, when I was mentioning earlier the high touch, high tech work, actually technology could allow us to use technology to teach some of the basic skills in an adaptive way, and then create space for the teachers to focus on these soft skills, the creativity, the sort of problem solving and so on, which is one of the things that we are trying to experiment with in Vietnam at the moment.
And there is another question on the role of the private sector and what could be like including private sector that's not for profit. We've recently seen a huge spurt in edtech, which is mostly from the private sector, a lot of private providers. But there are also a number of not-for-profit organizations that are taking up the challenges of learning and access and equity that you mentioned. How do you see this in the whole global partnership?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's, I've sort of personally done some work on this. I think in the global arena, and again, actually, you could really play a role in clarifying this. In the global arena, we have a confusion between who pays for education and then who delivers. And there's a lot of anxiety around private schools and the delivery through low cost private schools and so on, because people equate that with if we have a non-state school, therefore, this means that children have to pay for this themselves. Now, in many cases, that is the case, but we could envisage a system, and actually, if you look at Bangladesh, for example, a large amount of schooling is provided through non-state actors, but you could envisage a system where that provision is still paid for by the public sector. So, but I think exploring what the sort of modalities are, who the new actors are who could deliver education, and obviously setting boundaries and regulations around that. I think that creating an environment where there's clarity around what's required if you do run a school, and kind of making sure that we achieve our equity targets is really important. But I feel I've experienced this in the work that I've done in this space, that there is a lot of misunderstanding in the sector, uh, between kind of provision. What does provision mean? Provision doesn't always mean for profit. It could be all sorts of provision. And then what is the difference with actually the financing? It doesn't need to be that therefore then households finance. Now, again, as I said, in often this happens, and that is the case, but that goes back to this point we were making earlier, that governments need to invest more in early years, and they can do that in many ways, whether it's through non-state actors or state provision.
Um, I don't see any raised hands. Am I missing something? So please either raise your hands or put your question in the chat box. So I'm going to sneak in a question now, and then maybe I can also ask Brajesh and Songsup later if they have any points to make or to discuss with you. Lisbeth, one of your last points was about debt relief linked to education. ADB has a huge COVID recovery package, which contains a lot of public expenditure support. Recovery package for post COVID, but very little of that is really allocated for education. What are your thoughts on what could be those levers? And I was really also very struck by your action, the data you put for action one, the number of students that don't have access to sanitization, and it's quite a
Yeah.
stark number. So so when you think about this whole public expenditure support mechanisms post COVID, including the billions that ADB is providing, what could be the top three things that we can advocate for inclusion for education?
Yeah, well, I think it's first, there's two questions. One is, what should we advocate for? And there are a number of things we could draw from the white paper on this. But then the second piece is, how do we advocate for it? And the on the what, there are ways. For example, the conditional or the cash transfers. Many of these packages do have cash transfers. To what extent are we making sure that there is some link to education? Obviously, anything that can go towards the safe reopening of school, whether it's the sanitation, basic sanitation, school meals, and so on, very, very important. There is also obviously the need to train and reskill teachers to be able to support the children in this totally new context. So there are a number of things that definitely throughout the white paper we could identify. I think the bigger problem we have at the moment is that we're somehow not at the table, and we're actually, as in terms of the follow up to this, and if anybody wants to be part of this, do let us know. We are trying to figure out how could we start building a much greater dialogue with those authorities that are currently negotiating these packages. And I don't know within ADB who the people are who are kind of in the process of doing this. Within organizations like NDBs, we should identify it. We should also identify it more globally. What is the relationship we have with the IMF, for example, which is in negotiations around these packages? What is happening within countries? Is the Minister of Education armed with arguments to make the case for inclusion? We're not really good at that, and I think compared with the climate sector, for example, we are way behind, because when ministers of finance talk very easily about green recovery, green finance, and so on, they don't talk about educated finance or education and educated recovery, which is kind of striking. And we really want to think about what is it that we are missing? Why are we not in these conversations at the moment?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Lisbeth, there are a couple of other questions relating to learning loss. Richard Gonzalez is saying that, already you have 53% children, challenged on terms of foundational skills, and COVID is adding to it. His question is around TVET, which the learning loss may be even more severe, given that moving to an online skills development scenario has been more challenging
Yes.
than school studies. And Lynette Perez would like to know if there's been any global effort to kind of capture the extent of the learning loss,
Yeah, and
how to
I have
measure.
to,
And
yeah, and I have to say that we have to be quite careful that while we are emphasizing the foundational learning, which is kind of a message to governments that who have tended to sort of skew their budget in a big way, that we don't imply that there's no need for support for TVET and upskilling, because there's a huge need for support. I think the point that we are trying to make is that in terms of support for TVET, we should really look at a variety of financing options, and we should try and target, to the extent that we put public resources in, target those to the furthest left behind. Target those to those who are not literate when they're reaching age 20, and so on. So second chance types of programs that really can upskill those who are furthest behind. And then we really need to get much smarter about getting the private sector to help pay for some of the upskilling in the other parts of the system, because there is simply not enough money in many countries to fund the entire system. And what we've discovered in these discussions is that there's often almost a kind of lecturing towards governments in terms of how they ought to be spending their money and reallocate it to this, that, and the other. But we don't have very good solutions for them politically to then say, okay, if they have to reallocate their money away from like spaces like TVET or higher education, well, what do we do then? We can't just leave that there. There needs to be a search for solutions so that the reallocation of public resources can coincide with bringing in fresh resources from other sectors. So that's an area I think that we need to think much harder about. And I don't know if anybody in your team has done work on this. We would really love to know about it, because it's very important to look at it.
yes, I think this has to be a very ongoing kind of an assessment, as well as bringing evidence from different parts or different contexts in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
There's another question on teaching practice. You had a slide, Lisbeth, on teacher-centered and student-centered
Yes.
methodology. The question is whether, in the context of new and alternative modalities with action-based learning and so on, what are the prospects of scaling these up in underserved and disadvantaged regions, and what will it take to scale them up?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I think there may be two kind of pathways to scale. One is, because you are bringing in different people, you actually are unburdening teachers. So what really, in terms of the scaling of this in a resource constrained environment, is first going to be about much kind of smarter deployment of teachers. So making sure that the teachers are deployed in ways that we can have maximum use out of their particular skills, and then complementing that with some of these other actors, communities, parents, obviously more challenging if they're not literate, but there are a kind of host of ways that we are now seeing in very low resource contexts, where kind of teacher guides are being brought in, communities, health workers, and COVID has kind of accelerated this. So that's number one. I think that's the scaling there can happen by reorganizing almost. And we've been doing some work in Sierra Leone, for example, looking at teacher deployment, where we actually were using GIS data to try and map where teachers were vis-a-vis the needs. And what was clear that often sort of subject teachers aren't actually that far away from potentially another school that could benefit from their skills, but they're not being deployed there. So, and it's a data issue. That's why actually when we think about technology, using technology in a smarter way to deploy teachers and think about where the marginalized children are is very important. And then the rest of the workforce, obviously. But then the second piece, I do believe, is in the longer term, this is where technology could make a big difference. And I know we've said that the obviously student-centered technology will be a way off in some areas, but actually it's going very fast. And many countries are now investing in their digital infrastructure. And we need to, again, make sure that not a lot of money from the education budget is pumped into paying for large super highways, but that we are in the conversations that are ongoing about infrastructure projects for the digital economy, and making sure that we integrate education and schools into that. If we have technology, we believe, and that's one of the kind of visions for the high touch, high tech, and that we can actually bring child-centered learning at scale to the world, because you can use technology to take up some of the kind of labor-intensive work that has to do with checking children, making sure we know where they are, measuring their learning levels, and then teachers can complement that. That's the vision. Obviously, we're a way off, and we can use in the meantime technology also to train teachers, which is another way of scaling if we would want to go that way. So there's some options.
Okay, there's a comment from Mike Chong. Is wondering if it would be, for sustainable financing, whether it would be good to have a targeted endowment fund, so that the risk of budget cuts from governments when things are stressed or when there's fiscal stress, education budgets are not compressed. India introduced the education cess. It was originally 1% and then became 2%. But there was not much evidence of whether it was really contributing to, improving quality. So what are your thoughts on having a special endowment fund for education?
You mean at country level?
At country level.
Yeah. I'd love to look at that. That sounds intriguing. I can't comment on that, but if there is experience with this, and I know the Indian example of sort of the corporate tax, the charitable tax, which kind of created a flow of money. I don't know how much of that isn't going into education at the moment. But there are definitely...
It does go into education, but the additionality from the education budget is not very clear.
Yes.
Nor is it clear whether it really supported anything additional in terms of quality. But definitely goes to education.
Yeah. So yes, there are, I think we need to be creative, and I definitely think there is not a one solution, and we need to keep thinking about how we can bring more resources in a more sustainable way. I mean, taxation is generally speaking a kind of a sustainable way of funding education. That's been done in many countries. Obviously, it's a big struggle in a lot of developing countries at the moment to mobilize the resources through that system. So any kind of other types of practices are obviously good to look at.
There was a follow-up question from our economist, Paul Vanderberg. And so why are budgets for education falling during COVID? Is it because more money is needed for health? There's also wondering, if talking about your report, mentioned not spending money on things that don't work. Can we also have some list of things that do work?
Yeah.
And Santi, I also have a follow-up to the financing. Maybe I can add to that.
Go ahead, yes.
So basically, thank you very much for a very inspiring, presentation. My question relates to what you also talked about, the squeeze in budget, overall budget, hence it's having implication on education. So you gave examples of some areas which do not necessarily just talk about education, but benefit, outside of education also. But I think I just want to mention two areas. One is also got to do with modality. So local governments, by definition, you have the education usually is devolved to the local government. And I think we have a good opportunity to see how this can be a bigger agenda for local governments, and financing can incentivize. So when you talk about innovative financing, the second I think we discussed earlier is about digital skills and connectivity. So there is advantage, but also we discuss about risk. Risk being, whether this will divert scarce resources. But given that education is an enabling sector, I think we have to link with digital transition, and then perhaps argue for additional resources. So forward.
Before you begin, Lisbeth, again, if I can add one more thought, which is about not only do we need to spend more, but spend better, and how can we ensure that additional spending is also better spending?
Yeah. So just on the education budgets falling, I can share, this is actually a report that was issued late last year by a number of UN organizations and the World Bank, where they did a survey of countries, asking countries whether the budgets were being cut. At the moment, we actually don't have a lot of good data to see exactly what is happening. But from that survey that was done, this is where they found that 40% of the countries who responded in the low and lower middle income bracket reported that budgets were being cut. And sort of from the anecdotal evidence, we know that at least in 2020, that is likely because of diversion. So because in 2020, the sort of economic impact on the budget wasn't yet sort of immediate. So the budgets were sort of in place, and there was a kind of cut because there was diversion to health or economic recovery or economic sort of support. But I think what's going to happen in the next few years is actually when the decline in economic growth, which will then have an impact on tax revenue in a much bigger way, that's actually where then the cuts are going to happen, just because there is not enough there. We did a sort of simple analysis earlier on, and I can share that as well, which we wrote in a blog for CGD, where we looked at what happened in the last financial crisis and how how education was impacted following the crisis. And it also showed that education budgets fell, particularly in lower middle income countries, surprisingly. So it's actually not so much even the low income countries that are affected, but it's the lower middle income countries that are affected. And that's also because they tend to be dependent on revenue streams that are being affected by the global crisis much more so than other countries.
Yes, just following up on the same strand, like Inika had asked about spending better, and Kisun is wondering whether it will also have an impact on international, education development, because ultimately the pot of funding, whether it's for international agencies or for governments, is being stressed to deal with recovery, and many countries may be increasing their budget deficits in order to tide over this time. I mean, I heard in India that government, some of the government teachers were not paid a salary for up to 6 months. And in Tamil Nadu, where I'm right now, government opened up liquor sales because their revenues were really going down, and they're not able to cope with the budget requirements. So how do you see this like stress situation, and what can we collectively do to bring some back for education?
It is a really difficult situation, and I mean that's kind of what the IMF is currently dealing with. Is how could we? That's why actually the debt relief and the ability for countries to borrow is important, because as you said, the revenues are falling. The revenues have to come from somewhere. um, some of the cheapest finance is available through the MDBs. That's why I think the MDBs are so important at this particular time. Some countries need to get debt relief and get rid of all debt. That's very expensive at the moment. But then there actually is need for a new inflow of resources, either through the MDB. Some have also talked about these special drawing rights through the IMF. That's also a possibility. So external assistance will be critical, but I don't think it will come from kind of the regular ODA, sadly, because some of the biggest donors you've probably heard, for example, the UK is already cutting back. Not only its gross domestic product is falling, but then also the percentage they had pledged to keep to 0.7% of their GNI. They're now bringing it down to 0.5. So they are going to have to cut a huge amount of resources out of their international assistance. And so we need to find new solutions that leverage money. And that's where, again, this international finance facility is really leveraging resources in a really big way. And we hope we can get it off the ground in the coming months.
Yes. Songsup, would you like to share some of your thoughts at this time?
Hi, Lisbeth.
Hi,
Very
Songsup.
good to
Nice
see
to
you.
see you.
Always very pleased to see and hearing from you. First of all, we many thanks for your insightful presentation. It was really useful. Particularly, we're going to have an education retreat tomorrow. So I think your presentation will help us to rethink about education. You mentioned about crisis in the various aspects. I think this one we are also already facing. So we'll think about. Also, all your action you talk is very useful to us. We will also through the education retreat we will work on that. But I also one thing want to seek also your support, and since you are in the education leading the education commission, and also you work in the global area, while you in the Q&A you mentioned you call for greater dialogue with the private sector and also among the donors like MDBs and bilateral, all those, because we are now facing, I would say, extraordinary challenges. But it really requires global level of the forum, as you really kindly reaching to us. However, I don't see that much in health sector. Despite challenges, they're doing something with WHO, Gavi, doing that. But education sector, we don't have such equivalent forum. But this is what really needed because of the, as you mentioned, budget crisis. We need now is time to work with edtech company and private sector. But that's lacking. Hope that you can also add one more action plan, so you can help us to work on. With that, I like thanks to you.
Well, I would say on that, Songsup, we'd love to work with you. Actually, my colleague Rose is on the line here. We have the Education Commission has established an Asia hub in South Korea with our Commissioner Joo-ho Lee, who is now actually spearheading this work on building a global consortium on high touch, high tech, which is really about bringing companies together with governments, with sort of different actors to think about how we can do things in new ways. And there, by the way, we don't only think about K to 12, we need to think about TVET, we need to think about higher education as well. I know we haven't talked about that very much today, but there's a whole new era out there. And I truly believe that Asia, I fell in love in Asia, so this region is so close to my heart. But Asia can lead the world. That you are at the forefront of technology, you are at the forefront of experimenting, and the Asian Development Bank is right in the middle of that. So if you could think about sort of the kind of big sort of platforms that you could really push forward, kind of big new ideas, we would love to work with you on those and continue the conversation, because I think your bank is really pivotal in all of that. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to be the World Bank or some of these other banks located in other regions at the moment. So I really urge you to think about that tomorrow, and then let us know, and we'll come and help you.
Okay, thanks.
So we are at the top of the hour. So I'd like to extend big thanks to Lisbeth for kickstarting our discussions at the retreat. It's been a very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. A lot of work done and lots more to do. So, and we are very happy that you will be collaborating with us going forward. Thanks a lot for joining our event today. Before I let everyone go, I'd just like to remind that in the afternoon at 4:30, we have another presentation on how can universities respond to the fourth industrial revolution. Join this afternoon at 4:30. And thanks again, Lisbeth, and thanks to everyone for joining the call today. Bye-bye.
And thank you for all your help. I know some of you on the line helped with this product as well. So thank you. Those I haven't thanked, we are really grateful for your help.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Take care.
Thank
See you. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for Santi for great moderation.
Thank you.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you.